This is my true story. I helped an elderly woman cross the road every morning for almost a year because she reminded me of my wife who died 15 years ago. Those few minutes were the only peace I had in my lonely life, and I looked forward to seeing her kind face every day. But one morning she stopped in the middle of the street and pulled out an old photograph from her purse with shaking hands. When I looked at the picture, my whole world collapsed. Before I tell you what that photo revealed, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe so this story can reach more people. I lost my wife 15 years ago to breast cancer, and I never recovered from losing her. She was my entire world, and when she died, I felt like half of myself died with her. We had been married for 32 years, and we had no children because she could not get pregnant no matter how many treatments we tried. It was just the two of us against the world, and that was enough because we had each other. When the cancer took her, I was left completely alone in our old house, surrounded by memories that hurt too much to look at, but hurt even worse to throw away. I kept everything exactly the way she left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet, and her perfume bottles still sat on the dresser, and her reading glasses were still on the nightstand, where she had left them the night before she went into the hospital for the last time. I slept on my side of the bed and left her side untouched like she might come back someday. I knew it was unhealthy, but I could not let go, because letting go felt like killing her all over again. My days became a routine that kept me from thinking too much. I woke up at 6 every morning and made coffee and ate toast standing at the kitchen counter. I would sit in the living room and stare at her photo on the mantel until it was time to leave for my morning walk. I walked the same route every single day through the park and past the busy intersection near the grocery store. The routine was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. Every morning at 8 o'clock I would reach that intersection and I would see an elderly woman waiting to cross the street. She looked to be in her 70s with white hair and a gentle face, and she always wore a long coat even when the weather was warm. She walked slowly with a cane, and she would stand at the crosswalk looking nervous about crossing because the traffic was heavy and the cars drove too fast. The first time I saw her, I offered to help her cross, and she smiled at me with such gratitude that it made my chest ache. After that first time, I started looking for her every morning. She was always there at the same time, waiting at the same corner. I would walk up to her and offer my arm, and she would take it gently, and we would cross the street together. She never said much beyond thank you and have a blessed day. But something about her voice and her manner reminded me of my wife. She had the same gentle way of speaking, and the same soft smile, and the same warmth in her eyes when she looked at me. Those few minutes every morning became the only warmth in my frozen life. Helping this woman cross the street gave me a sense of purpose and made me feel like I was still useful to someone. She reminded me of what it felt like to take care of someone and protect someone the way I used to take care of my wife. Sometimes she would touch my arm lightly when we reached the other side, and that small gesture would carry me through the rest of my empty day. I never asked her name, and she never asked mine. We existed in this small ritual that required no words and no explanations. I did not want to know more about her because knowing more might break the illusion that she was somehow connected to my wife. In my mind, she was a gift from the universe, or maybe a ghost sent to comfort me. I needed to believe that because I had nothing else to believe in anymore. I looked forward to those mornings more than I wanted to admit. I would wake up thinking about seeing her at the intersection, and I would rush through my coffee so I would not be late. On the rare days when she was not there, I felt panicked and worried, and my whole day felt wrong. I needed her there waiting for me because she was the only human connection I had left in my isolated existence. She was the only reminder that I was still alive and still capable of doing something good for another person, even though I felt dead inside. For nearly a year, I helped this woman cross that intersection every single morning, and I never once learned her name. It felt wrong to ask because asking would make her real and separate from the fantasy I had built in my head. In my mind, she was connected to my wife somehow, even though I knew that made no sense. I told myself she was just a lonely elderly woman who needed help, but deep down I believed she was more than that. I believed she was sent to me for a reason I could not explain. She always smiled at me with the same grateful expression, and sometimes she would pat my arm gently before walking away. That small touch felt like my wife's touch, and it would stay with me for hours afterward. I started to notice little things about her that reminded me even more of my wife. She wore a silver bracelet on her left wrist that looked similar to one my wife used to wear. She had the same way of tilting her head slightly when she listened. She even smelled faintly of lavender, which was my wife's favorite scent. I never questioned why she felt so familiar, because I was afraid of the answer. Part of me wondered if I was losing my mind and projecting my wife onto this stranger. Part of me wondered if grief had damaged my brain so badly that I was seeing connections that did not exist. But I did not want to examine it too closely, because this woman and these morning encounters were the only things keeping me from completely giving up on life. Some mornings she would say things that made my heart stop. She would comment on the weather the same way my wife used to. She would mention loving the smell of rain or how the autumn leaves reminded her of childhood. These were things my wife had said to me hundreds of times during our marriage. I told myself it was just coincidence, but it felt like more than that. It felt like my wife was somehow speaking through this woman to remind me she was still with me. I started arriving at the intersection earlier, just to make sure I did not miss her. I would stand on the corner, waiting and watching for her to appear. When I saw her walking slowly toward the crosswalk, my heart would lift in a way it had not lifted since my wife died. Those few minutes with her became the highlight of my entire day, and sometimes the only reason I got out of bed in the morning. I never tried to extend our encounters beyond the time it took to cross the street. When we reached the other side, she would thank me and I would nod, and then we would go our separate ways. I did not follow her or ask where she was going because I did not want to ruin the mysterious comfort she provided. She existed in this perfect bubble where I could pretend my wife was still somehow present in my life through this gentle stranger. My friends had stopped calling me years ago because I had pushed them all away after my wife died. My neighbors had stopped trying to talk to me because I made it clear I wanted to be left alone. This woman at the intersection was my only human contact, and I guarded that connection fiercely. I did not want anyone or anything to interfere with the small piece of peace I had found in helping her cross the road every morning. I accepted this routine as fate's small mercy in my otherwise unbearable existence. I did not question it, and I did not analyze it. I just showed up every morning and offered my arm and walked her across the street and let that simple act of kindness fill the emptiness inside me. She was a ghost of comfort in my lonely life, and I needed her more than I needed food or sleep or anything else. Looking back now, I realize I should have asked questions. I should have wondered why she was always there at the exact same time. I should have wondered why she never mentioned family or friends. I should have wondered why she looked at me sometimes with an expression that seemed like guilt or sadness mixed with her gratitude. But I did not wonder about any of those things because I was too desperate for the comfort she provided to risk losing it by asking questions that might reveal uncomfortable truths. It was a cold Tuesday morning in late October, and the wind was blowing hard enough to make my eyes water. I arrived at the intersection at my usual time and saw her standing there waiting for me like always. She was wearing her long coat and holding her cane, but something about her looked different. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking more than usual, and she would not meet my eyes when I walked up to her. I offered my arm like I always did, and she took it, but her grip was tighter and more desperate than normal. We stepped off the curb and started crossing the street, and I could feel her trembling through her coat. I asked if she was feeling all right, and she did not answer. We were halfway across the intersection when the light changed and cars started honking at us to hurry up. I tried to walk faster, but she suddenly stopped moving right in the middle of the road. I told her we needed to keep moving because the cars were getting closer and the drivers were angry. But she just stood there frozen in place with tears running down her face. She let go of my arm and reached into her purse with shaking hands. I watched in confusion as she pulled out an old photograph that looked worn and faded like it had been handled too many times. She stared at it for a long moment, and then she pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. Her voice was breaking when she finally spoke, and she said, "I cannot carry this alone anymore." I looked down at the photograph in my hand, and my whole world stopped. The cars around us were honking louder, and people were yelling at us to get out of the street, but I could not move or breathe or think. All I could do was stare at the image in my hand and feel my heart breaking into pieces that would never fit back together. The photograph showed my wife. She looked younger than I remembered her, but it was definitely her. She was smiling at the camera with that beautiful smile I had fallen in love with decades ago. But she was not alone in the picture. She was standing next to the woman I had been helping cross the street for the past year, and between them, wrapped in a pink blanket, was a baby who could not have been more than 6 months old. I turned the photograph over with trembling fingers and saw a date written on the back in handwriting I recognized as my wife's. The date was 3 years before she died, 3 years before the cancer diagnosis, 3 years into a period of our marriage that I remembered as happy and peaceful and full of love. But this photograph was telling me a completely different story, and my brain could not process what I was seeing. The woman next to me was still crying, and she was saying something, but I could not hear her over the roaring in my ears. I looked at her face, and then back at the photograph, and I saw the resemblance I had been too blind to notice before. She had the same nose as my wife, and the same shape of face, and the same color eyes. They looked like sisters, but my wife had told me her only sister lived in Canada, and that they had not spoken in years. My chest felt like it was being crushed, and I could not get enough air into my lungs. My vision was blurring, and I realized I was crying, but I did not remember starting to cry. The woman grabbed my arm and pulled me to the side of the road just before a car almost hit us. We stood on the sidewalk, and she was talking fast and sobbing and trying to explain something, but I could not focus on her words because I was still staring at that photograph. Everything I thought I knew about my wife and my marriage was collapsing like a building falling down around me. The woman I had mourned for 15 years was holding a baby in this picture and standing next to someone who was clearly her sister. And somehow this was connected to the stranger I had been helping every morning without knowing who she really was or what secrets she was carrying about my dead wife. My hands would not stop shaking as I stared at the photograph, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My wife looked so happy in the picture, with her arm around this woman and her other hand resting gently on the baby wrapped in the pink blanket. I had never seen this photo before, and I had no memory of my wife ever mentioning a baby or spending time with a sister during that period of our lives. I thought back to 3 years before she died and tried to remember what we were doing then and whether she had disappeared for any length of time that I could not account for. I remembered that year clearly because it was right before things started getting difficult between us. She had become distant and secretive and would sometimes leave the house for hours without explaining where she was going. When I asked her about it, she would say she was visiting a friend or running errands, but she never gave me details. I had chalked it up to her going through something personal, and I gave her space because I trusted her completely. Now I realized that trust had been a mistake. The date on the back of the photograph was written in my wife's neat handwriting, and I recognized the pen she always used. She had written the month and year, and underneath it she had written the words, "My greatest joy and my deepest regret." I read those words over and over, trying to understand what they meant. What joy was she talking about? What regret was eating at her when she wrote those words on the back of this hidden photograph? I looked at the baby in the picture more closely and saw that it had my wife's eyes and her mouth. The baby was staring at the camera with a serious expression, and one tiny hand was reaching toward my wife's face. My wife was looking down at the baby with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was love, mixed with pain, mixed with something that looked like guilt. She had never looked at me that way in all our years together. My confusion was turning into creeping horror as my brain started putting pieces together that I did not want to fit. This was not just a random baby my wife was holding for a friend. This was not just a casual photograph taken at some family gathering I had not been invited to. The way my wife was holding that baby and looking at that baby told me this child meant something significant to her. And the woman standing next to her, looking just as emotional, was clearly involved in whatever secret my wife had been keeping from me. I looked up at the woman who had given me the photograph, and I saw my wife's face in her features. The same nose and the same chin and the same way of standing with her shoulders slightly hunched, like she was carrying a heavy weight. How had I not seen it before? How had I spent a year looking at this woman every morning and not recognized that she was related to my wife? I felt like an idiot for being so blind and so desperate for comfort that I had missed obvious signs that something was wrong. The woman was watching me with tears streaming down her face, and her expression was a mixture of guilt and relief. She looked like she had been waiting to give me this photograph for a long time, and now that she had finally done it, she did not know what to say. I wanted to scream at her and demand answers, but my throat was closed up, and I could not form words. All I could do was stand there holding this photograph that was destroying 15 years of memories I had held sacred. My chest was tightening with something that felt like a heart attack. Every anniversary I had mourned alone. Every birthday of hers I had spent crying at her grave. Every whispered, "I love you," I had said to her picture on the mantel. All of it now felt like lies because the woman in this photograph was not the woman I thought I had married. She was someone else entirely. Someone with secrets and betrayals and a whole life I knew nothing about. The woman's voice cracked as she started talking, and the traffic roared around us while people walked past, staring at us like we were crazy. She said, "I am sorry, I should have told you sooner, but I did not know how." She said she had been trying to work up the courage for months, and that was why she kept showing up at that intersection every morning, hoping I would be there. She said she recognized me the first time she saw me, and she knew immediately who I was, because my wife had shown her pictures of me years ago. She took a shaky breath and said, "I am your wife's sister, and my name is Margaret." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward against a lamppost. My wife had told me her sister Margaret lived in Canada and that they had grown apart after some family argument she did not want to talk about. My wife said they only spoke on birthdays and holidays and that Margaret had her own life and family far away. I had never questioned it because my wife seemed sad when she talked about her sister, and I did not want to push her to discuss painful family issues. But here was Margaret standing in front of me crying and telling me she had never lived in Canada. She said she had lived in the same city as us for the past 40 years, just 15 minutes away from our house. She said my wife had lied about the distance and the lack of contact because she needed to keep us separated. She needed to make sure I never accidentally ran into Margaret at a store or a restaurant or anywhere else, because Margaret knew secrets that would destroy everything. Margaret said the baby in the photograph was named Emma, and she was now 20 years old. She said Emma was my wife's biological daughter, but not mine. My knees almost buckled, and I had to grab the lamppost to keep from falling. I told her that was impossible because my wife could not have children, and we had spent years trying and failing to get pregnant. We had gone to specialists and tried treatments and cried together every time another attempt failed. My wife had been devastated by her infertility, and I had held her through so many nights when she sobbed about never being able to be a mother. Margaret shook her head and said that was another lie. She said my wife was perfectly capable of having children. The fertility problems had been made up to cover the truth about Emma. She said the baby in the photograph had been conceived during an affair my wife had with Margaret's husband. Her voice broke when she said it, and I could see the pain in her eyes that came from a betrayal that had destroyed her own marriage. She said the affair lasted 2 years, and during that time, my wife and Margaret's husband had fallen in love. They had tried to end it multiple times, but they kept coming back to each other. When my wife got pregnant, she panicked because she did not know what to do. She loved me and did not want to leave me, but she also loved him and wanted to keep the baby. Margaret said my wife had begged her to raise Emma as her own child and keep the secret buried forever. Margaret told me her husband's name was David and that he had been her college sweetheart and the father of her 2 other children. She said David and my wife had met at a family reunion that I had not attended because I was working. They connected immediately and started an affair within weeks. Margaret did not find out until my wife was already 6 months pregnant and showing. She said David confessed everything and begged for forgiveness, but Margaret could not forgive either of them for what they had done. Margaret said my wife gave birth to Emma in a hospital 2 hours away, where nobody knew her. Margaret was there for the birth and took Emma home that same day. The plan was for Margaret to raise Emma and for my wife to stay with me and pretend nothing had happened. David agreed to stay with Margaret for the sake of their other children, even though everyone knew the marriage was destroyed. They lived as strangers under the same roof for 3 years before David finally left and disappeared from their lives completely. Margaret said the affair between my wife and her husband started innocently at first, with long conversations and shared secrets, and an emotional connection that neither of them tried to stop. She said David told her later that he had fallen in love with my wife because she understood him in ways Margaret never did. My wife apparently felt the same way about David, and they convinced themselves that what they were doing was some kind of destiny or fate bringing them together. Margaret's voice was bitter when she said this, and I could hear decades of unresolved anger beneath her words. She explained that the affair continued for 2 years before my wife got pregnant. During that time, my wife would tell me she was visiting friends or going to work events or helping at church functions. But really, she was meeting David at hotels or at his office after hours or at an apartment he rented specifically for their meetings. Margaret said she suspected something was wrong, but David was good at lying and my wife was good at covering her tracks. Nobody caught them until it was too late and a baby was already growing inside my wife. When my wife realized she was pregnant, she told David immediately and they had to decide what to do. Margaret said David wanted my wife to leave me and run away with him and start a new life somewhere else. But my wife refused because she said she loved me too much to destroy me that way. Margaret laughed bitterly when she told me this and said my wife loved me, but apparently not enough to stay faithful or tell me the truth. My wife loved me enough to lie to my face for years, but not enough to give me the choice about whether I wanted to stay in a marriage built on betrayal. Margaret found out about the pregnancy when David finally confessed everything in a moment of guilt. She said she walked into their bedroom and found him crying, and he told her the whole story from beginning to end. She said she wanted to kill both of them, and she seriously considered it. She wanted to go to me and tell me everything and watch my world fall apart, the same way hers was falling apart. But my wife begged her not to do it and came up with a plan that would keep the secret contained. The plan was for my wife to disappear for a few months and claim she was taking care of a sick friend out of state. Margaret would tell people she was pregnant with her third child, even though the timeline was suspicious since her youngest was only 2 years old. My wife would give birth and hand the baby to Margaret, and then return to her normal life with me like nothing had happened. Margaret agreed to this insane plan because she wanted to keep her family together for the sake of her other children and because she somehow still loved David despite what he had done. So my wife lied to me and said her college friend was dying of cancer and needed someone to help care for her. She said she would be gone for several months and that it was something she had to do because this friend had no family. I believed her completely and I missed her terribly, but I supported her decision because I thought she was doing something noble and kind. The whole time she was gone, she was actually living with Margaret and preparing to give birth to her lover's child. She called me once a week and told me she loved me and missed me and could not wait to come home. Every word was a lie wrapped in more lies. Margaret said the birth was difficult and my wife almost died from complications. She said Emma was born healthy, but my wife hemorrhaged badly afterward and had to have emergency surgery. For a few terrifying hours, Margaret thought my wife would die and the secret would die with her. But my wife survived and held Emma for the first time, and Margaret said she had never seen anyone look at a baby the way my wife looked at Emma. It was pure love mixed with pure grief because she knew she was about to give her daughter away and pretend she never existed. I stumbled backward away from Margaret and almost fell into the street. A car honked at me and swerved around me, and the driver yelled something I did not hear because the roaring in my ears was too loud. The photograph was still clutched in my trembling hands, and I could not stop staring at it. Every detail in that picture was a lie that had been hidden from me for decades. My wife's smile was a lie. The happiness in her eyes was a lie. The sister she told me lived in Canada was standing right next to her in the photograph holding a secret that had destroyed multiple lives. I thought about every anniversary we celebrated after Emma was born. Every time my wife kissed me and told me she loved me. Every time we talked about our regret over not having children, and she would get tears in her eyes and say she wished things had been different. She had been lying through all of it. She had been carrying the knowledge that she did have a child, but that child was being raised by her sister as punishment for her affair. She had been living with that guilt, while I remained completely oblivious and trusting. I thought about all the times she had been distant or moody, and I had chalked it up to her health issues or work stress. Now I realized those moods were probably about Emma. She was probably thinking about her daughter and missing her and grieving the fact that she could not be a mother to her own child. And I had comforted her during those times, thinking I was helping her through some unnamed depression, when really she was mourning a secret life I knew nothing about. Every moment I thought was sacred between us was now tainted with doubt. When she told me I was the love of her life, did she mean it, or was she thinking about David? When she held my hand during movies or kissed me goodnight, was she wishing I was him? When we made love, was she pretending I was someone else? I would never know the answers to these questions because she was dead and buried, and I could not confront her or demand the truth or ask her how she could do this to me. Margaret was still talking and trying to explain more, but I could not listen anymore. She said something about how my wife had loved me and chosen me and stayed with me even when she could have left. She said my wife had made mistakes, but she had tried to protect me from the pain of knowing. She said my wife had carried tremendous guilt for the rest of her life, and that guilt had eaten away at her until the cancer finally took her. As if that was supposed to make me feel better. As if knowing my wife suffered somehow balanced out the suffering she caused me by lying for years. I looked at Margaret and saw my wife's face in her features, and I felt sick. This was the woman I had been helping cross the street every morning. This was the woman whose gentle touch reminded me of my wife. And all along she had been carrying this photograph and this truth, and watching me grieve for a woman who never really existed. She had let me help her and comfort myself with her presence, while knowing she was going to eventually destroy everything I believed about my marriage. I asked her why she waited so long to tell me. I asked her why she showed up at that intersection every day for a year and let me help her without saying anything. My voice came out harsh and angry, and she flinched. She said she had been trying to work up the courage because she knew telling me would destroy me. She said she had watched me at the intersection looking so lost and broken, and she had felt guilty about adding more pain to my life. But the guilt of keeping the secret had become too heavy and she could not carry it alone anymore. She said she thought I deserved to know the truth before she died. She said she was sick with heart disease and probably only had a few months left, and she could not go to her grave keeping this secret. She wanted to unburden herself, and she did not care that doing so would burden me with knowledge I could never unknow. Margaret sobbed and said she had recognized me the first time she saw me at the intersection months ago. She said she had been walking through the park trying to clear her head after a doctor's appointment, where she learned her heart condition was getting worse. She saw me standing on the corner waiting to cross, and she recognized me immediately from the photographs my wife had shown her years ago. She said her first instinct was to turn around and walk the other way, but something made her stay. Something made her want to see what kind of man her sister had married and lied to for so many years. She said she watched me help an elderly man cross the street that first morning, and she saw the kindness in my face and the gentleness in my actions. She said it made her sick because she realized I was exactly the kind of person who did not deserve what my wife had done to me. She said she went home that day and could not stop thinking about me standing on that corner completely unaware that my entire marriage had been built on lies and betrayal. The next morning she came back to the intersection and waited to see if I would be there again. When I showed up and offered to help her cross the street, she took my arm and felt a surge of guilt so strong she almost confessed everything right then. But she chickened out and just thanked me and walked away. She said she kept coming back every morning after that because she was trying to build up the courage to tell me the truth, but every time she saw my face, she lost her nerve. She said watching me grieve my wife like she was a saint had been torture. She would see the sadness in my eyes and the way I moved through the world like I was only half alive, and she knew I was mourning a woman who did not deserve that kind of devotion. She said every morning when I helped her cross the street, she wanted to scream the truth at me, but she was too afraid of what would happen. She was afraid I would hate her for destroying my memories. She was afraid I would have a heart attack or do something to hurt myself. She was afraid of being responsible for more pain when she had already caused so much. She said her husband David had left her and their children 3 years after Emma was born. He could not handle the guilt of what he had done, and he could not stand living in a house with a constant reminder of his betrayal. He moved across the country and cut off all contact with Margaret and their children. He sent child support checks, but he never called and never visited, and eventually he stopped sending money too. Margaret said she had raised 3 children alone, including Emma, who was a constant reminder of the worst betrayal of her life. She said Emma did not know the truth about who her real mother was. Margaret had raised her as her own daughter and never told her that the woman in the photograph was actually her biological mother. She said Emma had asked questions over the years about why she looked different from her siblings and why there were no baby pictures of her with Margaret pregnant. But Margaret had made up stories and avoided the truth because she did not know how to explain that Emma was the product of an affair between her aunt and her father. Margaret said my wife had visited Emma secretly over the years. She would make excuses to me about errands or appointments, and then she would go to Margaret's house and spend an hour with Emma. She would bring gifts and toys and pretend to be Aunt Sarah visiting from out of town. Margaret said Emma had loved these visits and always asked when Aunt Sarah would come back. My wife would cry on the drive home, according to Margaret, because she hated lying to everyone, but she could not figure out how to tell the truth without destroying multiple lives. She said my wife had begged her to keep the secret forever and to never tell me what had happened. My wife made Margaret promise that I would never find out because she said it would kill me and she could not live with that guilt on top of everything else. Margaret had kept that promise for 15 years after my wife died, but now she was dying too, and she could not keep carrying the weight of this secret alone. I could not speak, and I could not breathe, and I felt like my entire body was shutting down. My chest hurt, and my vision was blurring, and I thought I might be having a heart attack right there on the sidewalk. Margaret reached out to steady me, but I jerked away from her touch because I could not stand the thought of her hands on me. Those were the same hands that had touched my wife and held the baby my wife had with another man. Those were the hands that had kept this secret for decades while I lived in ignorant bliss, thinking my marriage was real. I looked down at the photograph again and tried to see it with fresh eyes. My wife was not just holding a baby in this picture, she was holding her daughter, her child with the man she had an affair with for 2 years. The man she apparently loved enough to risk everything for, but not enough to leave me for. I was her safe choice, her backup plan. The husband she kept around while she carried on a secret relationship with her sister's husband and created a child she had to give away. Every memory I had of her was now contaminated with this knowledge. I thought about our wedding day and wondered if she had already met David by then. I thought about our honeymoon and wondered if she was thinking about someone else. I thought about all the years we spent trying to have children and realized now that those fertility treatments had been a performance. She had let doctors examine her and run tests and prescribe medications, all while knowing she was perfectly capable of getting pregnant because she had already done it with someone else. The cruelty of that deception was breathtaking. She had let me believe we were struggling together with infertility. She had let me feel guilty, wondering if maybe it was my fault we could not conceive. She had cried with me and held me and told me it was okay that we would never have children together. And the whole time she knew she had a daughter living 15 minutes away being raised by the sister she told me lived in Canada. The layers of lies were so deep I could not see the bottom. I thought about the kindness I had shown Margaret every morning for the past year. I had helped her cross the street because she reminded me of my wife and because doing something good for someone else made me feel less empty inside. But really, I had been helping the woman who held the proof of my wife's betrayal. I had been offering comfort to someone who knew the truth about my marriage and chose to stay silent while I mourned a fantasy. The irony was so painful, it made me want to vomit right there on the sidewalk. Margaret was still crying and trying to apologize and explaining that she had been carrying this guilt for so long and she just wanted peace before she died. But I did not care about her guilt or her peace. She was unburdening herself by destroying me, and she was calling it honesty, when really it was just selfishness. She could have taken this secret to her grave and let me live out my remaining years believing my wife had loved me. Instead, she chose to shatter everything I had left just so she could die with a clear conscience. I wanted to scream at her that she was a coward for waiting so long. I wanted to tell her that if she really cared about protecting me, she would have kept her mouth shut forever. But I could not form words because my throat was closed and my mind was spinning, and I felt like I was drowning in information I could never unknow. The woman I loved had never existed. The marriage I thought was sacred had been a lie. The grief I had carried for 15 years had been wasted on someone who did not deserve it. I looked at Margaret one last time and saw my wife's face in her features, and I felt a hatred so intense it scared me. This woman and my wife had conspired together to fool everyone around them. They had built elaborate lies and maintained them for years without cracking. And now Margaret stood here crying like she was the victim, when really she was just as guilty as my wife for perpetuating this nightmare. I dropped the photograph on the pavement and walked away without saying a single word to Margaret. I left her standing there crying on the sidewalk, and I did not look back. I heard her call my name, but I kept walking faster and faster until I was almost running. I needed to get away from her, and away from that intersection, and away from the truth that was crushing me from the inside out. I walked for hours through streets I did not recognize until my legs gave out, and I collapsed on a bench in a park I had never been to before. That night I went home and gathered every photograph of my wife I could find. I took them out of frames and pulled them off walls and collected them from drawers and albums. I carried them all outside to the fire pit in my backyard, and I burned them one by one. I watched her face curl and blacken and turn to ash. I watched our wedding photos disintegrate and our anniversary pictures melt away, and every captured moment of our life together reduced to nothing. The smoke made my eyes water, but I did not stop until every single photograph was gone. I burned her clothes next, and her books, and her jewelry, and anything else I could find that reminded me of her. I stood in the backyard at 3 a.m. feeding our memories into the flames and feeling nothing but rage and betrayal. The neighbors probably thought I had lost my mind, but I did not care. I needed to erase her from my house and from my life because keeping her things felt like honoring a lie. She did not deserve to be remembered or mourned or treated like she had been a good wife. I put the house up for sale within a month and moved out as soon as I found a buyer. I could not stay in the place where we had lived together and built a life that I now knew had been fake. Every room held memories that were poisoned by the truth Margaret had revealed. I moved into a small apartment across town and got rid of almost everything I owned. I started over with new furniture and new routines, and a new route for my morning walks that did not go anywhere near that intersection. I never went back to that corner, and I never saw Margaret again. Part of me wondered if she died like she said she would, or if she was still out there somewhere feeling relieved that she had finally unburdened herself. I did not look for her, and I did not try to find out what happened to Emma or David or anyone else connected to that nightmare. I cut off that entire part of my life and pretended it had never existed. I tried to date a few years later, but I could not do it. I could not trust anyone enough to let them get close because my wife had taught me that even the person you love most and trust completely can be lying to your face for years. I could not believe anything anyone told me because I knew how easy it was to maintain a lie if you were committed enough. Every woman I met seemed like a potential betrayer, and I could not get past that fear. So I stayed alone and accepted that I would die alone because my capacity to love had been destroyed. People asked me sometimes why I never remarried after my wife died, and I would just say I was still grieving. That was easier than explaining that I was not grieving at all anymore. I was just empty. The woman I thought I had lost never existed in the first place, so there was nothing to grieve. I had loved a ghost and mourned a fantasy and wasted 15 years of my life on memories that were built on lies. I learned I could not love anyone ever again, not because my wife died, but because the woman I loved had never truly existed at all. I helped a stranger cross the road every morning for a year because she reminded me of my wife and made me feel less alone. Then she handed me a photograph that proved my wife was the real stranger all along. Everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty and marriage turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. The truth set me free from my grief, but it also destroyed my ability to ever trust or love again. Some truths are not meant to be known, and some secrets should stay buried, because knowing them does not heal you. It just gives you a different kind of wound that never stops bleeding.